I'm joined now by the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, Kyle Kondik. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about some changes that we've seen with how you and your team have begun rating these races as we head toward midterms. I want to start first and foremost with what you think the implications might be for somebody like Lisa Murkowski, for example, who was this crucial vote for the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill in the Senate. Of course, she's not up in this term, but just the implications for somebody like this who will obviously have a major role in the passage of this bill.
Murkowski, I think, even though she won her last race and races in the past with substantial crossover support from independents and Democrats, I think she is still fundamentally a Republican. She was elected as Republican last time. She was at one point elected as an independent way back in 2010 after she had lost her primary. But fundamentally, she's a Republican. While she does break from the party on certain things, she did come through for them on this big vote. Now, it wasn't without some price tag. I mean, there are pieces of this bill that are designed specifically for her, but that's not unheard of. You remember the sort of the horse trading about the Affordable Care Act in the 2009 and 2010 range. There are little provisions put in there, or maybe significant provisions put in there to appeal to individual members for their individual districts or states. So again, that's not necessarily unprecedented, even though you sort of take a step back. You're not jaded about this stuff the way that I am, and you say, oh well, that's pretty distasteful, but it is what it is.
What about the environment in Alaska? We saw Mary Peltola win in Alaska. She's since lost, but still it shows that Alaska may not be as far-right Republican, solidly Republican as we might have presumed in the past.
Yeah, the state has changed a little bit in that the Republicans are not quite as strong as they used to be there, although Donald Trump did still win the state. But I think it was maybe 12, 13 points in 2024. His margin was only about 10 in 2020, and you have Lisa Murkowski there, who again provided an important vote on this and is going to vote with the Republicans most of the time, but she does have kind of mavericky sorts of votes here and there. The state legislature, this is down in the weeds a little bit, but the state legislature often has these sort of like cross-partisan coalitions that govern things, and so it's just kind of a quirky state politically. The state does have an open governor's race coming up next year. Peltola is a possibility to run for governor, and if she did, as a Democrat, that might actually be kind of a legitimate toss-up race. Again, even though Alaska definitely has a Republican lean to it.
Okay, so let's talk about another big retirement announcement or announcement not to seek re-election, and that is Thom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina. What are you looking at in terms of that race as we head toward 2026? Because that seems to be the biggest pickup opportunity for Democrats.
Yeah, we had started that race as a toss-up, and we kept it there after Thom Tillis retired. Tillis is in some ways kind of a generic Democrat, Republican in terms of his electoral performance. He's won really narrow races in both 2014, defeating incumbent Democrat Kay Hagan, and then holding off Democrat Cal Cunningham by a little less than 2 points in 2020. Tillis did have a little bit of sort of residual Republican strength in suburban Raleigh and suburban Charlotte, which helped him do about, I think it was kind of 4/10 of a point better in terms of margin than Donald Trump did in 2020. But they were pretty, their overall performances were pretty similar in 2020. And as an open seat, naturally, I think for any party, you'd kind of rather be running for an open seat if you're the challenger party. All eyes are on former Democratic Governor Roy Cooper, who has thought about running. I think he'd probably be a pretty strong recruit for Democrats there. The Republican side, there are any number of people who could run. Maybe the most prominent person is the person whose last name is Trump, Laura Trump, who was a co-chair of the RNC. She's Trump's daughter-in-law, and presumably, if she ran, she would have Trump's endorsement. And the thing that I'm just sort of curious about here is that a lot of Republicans seem to believe that they need to sort of be Trumpy, I guess, to try to get as much of the midterm turnout as they can without Trump on the ballot. Well, you might have an instance where you actually would have someone with the last name of Trump on the ballot in North Carolina, despite it being a midterm year and not a presidential race. I do still think generally the turnout environment should at least be a little bit better for Democrats kind of across the board than it was in 2024. And in a state like North Carolina, which is very close and competitive, although, has a little bit of a Republican lean, just a little bit better of a turnout environment could take North Carolina from being like 52-48 Republican state to more of a 50-50 one. And then we'll see what the candidate contrast ends up being. But, if Cooper doesn't run, if Laura Trump doesn't run, you might have actually big competitive primaries on both sides, hypothetically.
If we do see a Roy Cooper, who, again, to your exact point, would likely be the strongest, at least as of right now, the strongest Democratic recruit, and Laura Trump on the Republican side, is there any polling yet to suggest how that race would turn out?
There hasn't been anything yet. North Carolina is a state that has it's polled pretty often. There are a lot of university polls of that state. Obviously, North Carolina has been a presidential battleground in recent years, so there's been some attention on it, but I haven't really seen anything lately. Tillis himself would often trail Cooper in polling, although that's not necessarily predictive because one other thing about North Carolina is that it's not uncommon for Democrats to be kind of overstated in polling in North Carolina, which we've seen in other places and in other kinds of races. So, Cooper is the one who would have the name ID as the former governor who just left office at the end of last year, although, or Trump is a Trump, so I guess she'd have name ID too.
Correct.
At least people recognizing her last name, if not necessarily knowing her all that well. She was floated as a possibility to be appointed to the Senate seat that Marco Rubio left behind when he became Secretary of State in Florida. Obviously, that didn't happen. Trump, she has some connections to the Wilmington area in North Carolina, so she's not some sort of total stranger to North Carolina or anything like that.
What about the always elusive Maine Senate seat in terms of Susan Collins' popularity?
Collins makes smart votes to break from her party from time to time. I think she just made another one in voting against the quote unquote one big beautiful bill.
Yeah.
It seemed like Republicans were trying to get her support in certain ways, but she voted against it. But from a Republican perspective, with a 53-47 majority and the ability to potentially hand out what we call kind of a hall pass or two to vulnerable members. I mean, Collins is the only Republican senator who represents the state that Kamala Harris won. And so obviously she's the only one in that sort of situation who's on the ballot in 2026. The situation with Collins is pretty strange and pretty unpredictable. She was a big underdog in the polls back in 2020. She ended up winning. And even the polling now, there's wide disparities on what her actual image is. So let me give you a couple examples of just some recent polling. So Pan Atlantic, which is a Maine pollster, they have her favorability 49% favorable, 45% unfavorable. That's not great, but it's also not bad.
Yeah.
University of New Hampshire just did a poll. They had a favorability 14%, 57% unfavorable, and they also offer a neutral option, which is 26%. But you can see that's a huge difference.
Right.
I mean, one poll makes it look like she has no chance of winning, and the other one suggests that maybe she would be okay. We're still waiting to see who the Democrats get to run there. There's a former congressional staffer named Jordan Woods who's running, but I wouldn't say that he's some sort of top tier recruiter. At least he's an unproven person. Maybe he proves to be a great candidate, but I think Democrats are looking for someone else there, and there's a lot of focus on the outgoing governor there, Janet Mills, as a potential Collins challenger, and she reportedly is considering it.
And we've seen that unpredictable polling play itself out in Maine as well. I mean, Sarah Gideon back in 2020, I believe it was it 2020 or 2018?
2020. Yeah.
2020. There were polls that were showing her 10, 12 points up ahead of Susan Collins. And of course, to your exact point, Susan Collins was able to pull out a win in that race. So we've seen in an environment where it so often feels like polling is not working. Nothing exemplifies that more than the polling that we've seen come out of the state of Maine. I want to move over to the Nebraska Senate. We had an insurgent challenger come out in the last election cycle. That was Dan Osborne, who ran as an independent. Of course, he garnered all of the support of the Democrats as well. But what are we looking at in terms of the prospect of a Dan Osborne challenge again in the other in the other Senate seat in Nebraska?
Yeah, so Osborne is exploring a run. I think it seems like he's basically going to run.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's official, but this time it's probably going to be a better political environment. There's just the non-presidential party in a midterm. That's kind of when you want to be the opposition party, running in an election. But Nebraska is also definitely a Republican-leaning state, and I think that Senator Fisher, who Osborne challenged last time. I think she got, kind of caught flat-footed a little bit. Senator Ricketts, I think, is probably, paying closer attention to this and is ready for the challenge. So I wouldn't, I mean, the Democrats are going to need kind of a big upset or two if they want to have any chance of winning the Senate next year. Maybe Nebraska would be part of it. I think it's probably fairly unlikely, but it should at least be on people's radar screen.
So what are you looking at big picture in terms of the House and the Senate as of right now, if we were to do a snapshot in time, what we could expect if the election was today?
In our U.S. House ratings, we have 209 seats, safe, likely, or leaning Democratic, 207 safe, likely leaning Republican, and then 19 toss-ups. So we've got in terms of the ratings, we've got the Democrats a little bit closer to the magic number of 218 than the Republicans. I'd say the Democrats, just based on history, are probably bigger favorites to flip the House than what those ratings would suggest, although there are paths for the Republicans to hold on. One thing to watch coming up over the next month or two or three is that there's the potential for a new congressional map in Ohio that would maybe help the Republicans get an extra seat or two there. There's the possibility of Texas Republicans going back to the drawing board on their map. Maybe they're able to squeeze a few extra seats out of that state. That would make it harder for Democrats, although I think they probably would still be favored even in that event. But that would, if the Republicans keep the House, that might be part of the story. But I do think Democrats are favored in the House. There was a really big House retirement very recently. Don Bacon of Nebraska 2nd District, which is the only House district represented by a Republican that gave Kamala Harris more than 50% of the vote. That is now an open seat. Harris won that seat by about 4.5 points. We now have Democrats as favored to flip that as an open seat, and that's reflected in that top line number I just said a minute ago. In the Senate, Democrats need to net 4 seats to win the Senate majority. It's 53-47 Republican right now. The Democrats also have some vulnerable seats of their own to defend. John Ossoff in Georgia, although Brian Kemp, the popular governor there, did not run, and so that was really good for Ossoff. Open seat in Michigan, where the candidate fields seem a little bit fluid. And then, Democrats have an open seat in North Carolina to target. Susan Collins in Maine is a target, although how good of one is we're still trying to figure out. But even if Democrats were to hold all their current seats and flip Maine and North Carolina, that would still be a 51-49 Republican Senate. And so to actually get the majority, they got to do all that other stuff, but then also maybe try to flip Texas, where John Cornyn is an underdog in his primary. Colin Allred, the Democratic nominee there in 2024, former House member, just announced that he's running again. Joni Ernst maybe in Iowa, John Husted in Ohio. You mentioned Nebraska, but these are all states that Donald Trump won by double digits,
right?
Kind of low teens in terms of the margins in 2024. So those are pretty heavy lifts in an era where the presidential results are pretty strongly correlated with the down ballot results. So I do think the Republicans are pretty decent favorites in the Senate right now, but maybe something happens to sort of shake that loose as we move along here.
Yeah, I mean, look, if ever there was an environment where something like that could happen, this is very likely it. But still, to your exact point, these are going to be heavy lifts in these states that Donald Trump and Republicans have proven successful in election cycle after election cycle. I do want to dig in real quick to one race in particular. We've seen a lot of reporting that there have been discussions among Joaquin Castro, James Tallarico, Beto O'Rourke, and Colin Allred about who would run for the Senate. Obviously, you just mentioned that Colin Allred did announce that he's running for Senate. I don't think that precludes the other 3 guys from either announcing themselves or deciding who among themselves would be the next candidate to run from that block. But do you have any indication of how these guys might perform against either John Cornyn or the more extreme Republican? I believe he's the current Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, and Paxton is the favorite in the primary as we're talking now.
Which is better for Democrats. In a weird way, it's better for Democrats because he is a weaker general election candidate, but also worse for Democrats in the sense that if he does pull out the win, which it's Texas, definitely not off the table, then you've got Ken Paxton, who's going to make John Cornyn look like John McCain.
Yeah. I mean, I think Paxton would still be favored in the general election, but I do think that the door might be ajar for Democrats in that state. Remember back in 2018, that was the last kind of big Democratic midterm year, and 2025 has felt a lot like 2017, so maybe 2026 will feel a lot like 2018 too. Beto O'Rourke came within 3 points of beating Ted Cruz that year. So it's not impossible. And you do have already a primary in Texas because there's also a former astronaut. I think his name is Terry Virts, who just announced as well. And of course, we saw Mark Kelly is a former astronaut, do quite well in Arizona in his Senate races, and so that's also a person to watch. But you could actually have a competitive Democratic primary. And usually, you say, oh well, primaries are bad because you waste money in the primary or whatever. But actually, I kind of wonder if in this instance a primary might not actually be the worst thing in the world, just because Texas is such a huge state that these candidates might need a platform to sort of, test themselves and to get their names out.
Right.
Now, look, there'll be, a resource challenge in the general election, although, a Democrat maybe running against Ken Paxton in a blue leaning midterm, that would probably turn the money spigot on, at least in terms of, small dollar donations and that sort of thing. So, look, Democrats are going to have to try to play offense in places beyond Maine and North Carolina, and there are several states competing for that role. Texas might be a part of it. And again, it may very well be hopeless for Democrats, but it does bear watching, particularly with this primary situation on the Republican side.
Kyle, where can folks who are watching and listening right now keep up with any changes that you guys make at Crystal Ball?
Yeah, so centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball. Visit our website. You can see all of our ratings there. And you could also sign up for free to get our email newsletter. We usually come out at least once and often, usually twice a week. We just had, pieces this week about the Nebraska 2 with Don Bacon retiring, and also the North Carolina Senate race. So we're, trying to keep on top of this stuff.
Well, appreciate all your time today, and we'll definitely be speaking soon.
Thank you.